Welcome to Radio Makua, a people-centered podcast. I am your host, Musa Wenkosi. In today's episode, we look into the financialization of the just energy transition and find out to what extent has the funding benefited communities. This episode is part of a limited series on green hydrogen, produced by Mining Affected Communities United in Action and Women Affected by Mining United in Action, or Makua Wamua. This is a social justice movement that has a strong hold and organizes communities affected by mining activities in South Africa. Coming up in this episode, I speak to two researchers from the Southern Center for Inequality Studies, based at Wits University, about issues surrounding grants meant for the just energy transition.
So there's this power imbalance where these international countries might be shifting or kind of controlling some of the focus of where this funding is going. And if we were to determine it all on our own, and if we had better kind of more influence in this negotiation, we might be able to determine those things ourselves, which would ultimately be better for our broader socioeconomic issues like inequality and unemployment. We can't just address climate change. We have to think about these things holistically.
But I also think that kind of domestically, we need to have a much clearer kind of self-defined kind of policy orientation that is also about our interests. So for example, I think green hydrogen is such a classic case. We really need massive upscaling of renewable energy. We need massive investment into the grid. And yet we're pumping investment into green hydrogen, which requires renewable energy, but that will go essentially offshore and be exported.
The Just Energy Transition Implementation Plan is South Africa's roadmap for achieving decarbonization in a just manner. The plan identifies 6 priority areas, namely electricity, Mpumalanga just transition, new energy vehicles, green hydrogen, skills, and municipalities. Our interest in this episode and series is on the priority area of green hydrogen. In a groundbreaking report titled, "What Happened to the Energy Transition Grant Funding?" we learned that most of the funds went to green hydrogen. South Africa received over $8.5 billion as part of the package to assist the country achieve its objective of a just transition. To get a sense of what this means and how the funds have benefited communities, I speak to 2 of the researchers who contributed to the explosive report that followed the money and its use. We discuss a range of issues, from the source of the money, South Africa's strategy towards climate change, role of communities and organized labor to hold government accountable in ensuring that the energy transition is indeed premised on the principle of justice and centers communities. To ground our conversation, we began from understanding the state of climate change debate in South Africa.
Thanks so much for having us. So my name is Julia Taylor. I'm a researcher at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies, which is based at Wits University. And I work on the Climate Change and Inequality Project, which is focused on issues of climate justice, just transition, and more broadly, kind of the issues of socioeconomic inequality as they relate to climate change.
Hi, I'm Katrina Lehmann-Grube. I'm also a researcher in the Climate Change and Inequalities program at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies. And as Julia mentioned, we're broadly interested in issues that kind of combine the concerns of climate change and inequality. And one of our big focuses is on the just transition happening in South Africa and some of our concerns about whether or not it is a just process or not.
Julia, where will you say we are in terms of just the conversations around climate change? Have we moved past the climate denialism? And how would you sort of assess where we are, whether there is a buy-in from everyone involved, especially the supra-international organizations, governments, organizations, where we are in terms of just, the climate change conversation at the moment?
My experience is actually that we seem to have moved on from that. I think most stakeholders, from students to trade unions to the private sector to government seem to be all kind of at a point where we understand that climate change is happening. We are currently experiencing the impacts. There are various instances that have been made more likely because of climate change, such as recent droughts, recent heat waves, flooding. These kinds of extreme events are becoming, I think, more common because of climate change and more severe because of climate change. And so there does seem to be a broad acceptance that climate change is happening. And now the question is, how does South Africa respond? And where do we place ourselves in the broader kind of global context of climate change responses? Because we do have a relatively smaller contribution internationally, although we are a big contributor in terms of the African continent. So how do we navigate that tension, being a smaller contributor, but actually still having an important role? And then also, what does that mean for our internal kind of policies? Where does climate change fit in our priorities, in our list of kind of policy priorities? Because often, the conversation becomes, well, actually, we have way too many social issues to start thinking about climate change. So why are we even talking about this? So there is a acceptance that it's a real issue, that, that it's happening, that there needs to be a response. But I think when it comes to the detail of, how much do we prioritize this above other social issues? And how much attention do we give this in our context because of our position internationally? Then there's a bit more kind of disagreement.
South Africa's initiative towards, addressing the crisis of climate change has been various commitments and policy positions that it has taken. And I just want to find out from you, Catherine, there is a paper that you guys jointly sort of wrote where you were tracing the money, around some of the commitments that the country has made. I mean, for a lay person, when they say grants or just energy grant, the assumption is that it's almost like donation. What were some of the preliminary questions? And if you can make or help us make a distinction, are these concessional loans and what does it mean? What are the consequences for South Africa?
Yeah, so maybe a little bit of background if that's also helpful. So South Africa signed this kind of deal with several countries in the global north. And that was kind of a climate finance package. So kind of when it was announced, it was, South Africa's going to get, $8.5 billion in climate finance from these countries. When we then saw the kind of Just Energy Transition Investment Plan, which detailed some of where that money would go and in what form, right, we found out that actually only a really small proportion is grants. So grants means that the money is given and there's no kind of repayment process. Only 4% in that kind of original outline was supposed to be grants. It's a little bit more now because other countries have come on board. But the majority of the kind of package was either commercial loans, so that's that kind of standard interest rates, or concessional loans where there's kind of an interest rate that you wouldn't necessarily get on the market. Unfortunately, even though the bulk of the money came as loans, we don't actually know where that money has gone. So there's been very little transparency about kind of the largest part of that funding, what the conditions are, what the interest rates are, what's it being spent on, who's getting the money. There's kind of no publicly available single data source or a kind of platform where you can get that information. Luckily, we do have that for the grants, though. So last year in December, government published kind of a full register. So basically a list of where all the grant portion of the money is gone. So it really is a small section, but it still gave us really useful insight that we didn't have before into kind of the processes that the just energy transition is happening and what kinds of projects, who's getting the money, for what topics, etc. So the grant portion, which we actually just had an update, it's about kind of 11 billion rand at the moment. And kind of that's spread out across a variety of different things. So there's the green hydrogen project, there's some skills things, there's projects specific to Mpumalanga. There's quite a lot of technical assistance for things like feasibility studies, etc. So that's kind of where we're at. This is the only information that we have so far that we've been able to work with, and that's what we wrote the article about.
And Julia, I don't know whether you want to jump in, especially on the issue of, if you look at the priority areas, right, that Catherine sort of highlights, so green hydrogen, the Mpumalanga, transition, do we know from the registry, as to how the money was spent, or in what specifically where the money was spent, and whether communities, host communities, have been able to be part of that process, for the justice part of it?
Unfortunately, the proportion of, as Katrina mentioned, the proportion of grants was so small. And then the amount of money allocated to kind of the most affected communities, who are often seen as kind of communities who are living in coal mining regions, such as in Mpumalanga, or workers in that sector, not really the main beneficiaries of some of these grants. So at the moment, what we can see on the grant register is that electricity infrastructure is about 20% of the funding in terms of grants. Green hydrogen has 24%, but those are kind of capacity building and feasibility studies, those kinds of things. Then the just transition in Mpumalanga is about 23%. So, that's actually quite a small portion allocated to those affected communities in Mpumalanga. Municipalities broadly is allocated 13%, and then skills is only 11%. And that's been a huge issue because trade unions and workers haven't really been involved in the development of this investment plan. So firstly, one of the controversies in the development of the plan is that it was released and published a few days before COP in 2021. And it only then was shared with the public for public comment after it was released. So actually there's been a lot of frustration because that's not how, development and consultation and participatory kind of processes work. Ideally, it should have been a draft that was released kind of locally, that was internally discussed and consultations could happen. And only then is it launched on a large kind of international scale at COP. So that process was a bit backwards. So the investment plan didn't incorporate the preferences and interests of workers and other stakeholders across the board. The implementation plan, which was released kind of a year later, did try to incorporate some of those different interests. But still at the moment, skills kind of hasn't been a massive part of the grant allocation. And one of the issues is that even though South Africa is saying that this plan, this Just Energy Transition Partnership and the associated investment plans and implementation plans have been determined by South African interests or South African stakeholders, that process wasn't clear. So there's still a lot of confusion as to why green hydrogen, new energy vehicles, and electricity were chosen as the top three things in the very beginning. Why were those selected? There's a lot of controversy around green hydrogen. Do we have enough electricity to provide for our own national needs, let alone water, because it's a very water-intensive process. So, I think there's been controversy around the priorities of the plan as well as the processes. And so a lot of kind of civil society organizations, trade unions have kind of raised concern about that. And we still haven't really seen, there was a consultation process after the launch of the investment plan, but we still haven't really seen adequate transparency and an effort to kind of bring in different stakeholders, I think, in the planning.
And, just, staying with you, Julia, on the point that you're making, do we know the majority of the investment, where it comes from, and whether from that we can make the argument that there is, remnants or elements of green imperialism, around the just transition that is happening in South Africa?
Yes. So the finance that's coming through this JP is from the US, the UK, the EU, France, and Germany. Those were the kind of initial countries that were involved. Since then, the Netherlands has joined, and I think 2 other countries, but I forget which ones. I'm sure Katrina can update. Sorry, I also wanted to correct myself. I said November 2021, but it was actually November 2022 that the investment plan was launched. All these kind of different dates can be confusing. But yes, so those countries are the kind of funders in this partnership. And so the US, UK, EU, France, and Germany were the original funders. And what that means is that, yeah, I mean, if you think about those countries, they have a historical influence in world trade, are currently hold significant power in terms of their currencies, how their kind of GDP, that kind of thing. So there is an imbalance of power in this partnership, which I think is concerning, because this is supposed to be an initiative that supports South Africa to pursue its climate change response. And what that would mean for South Africa, if we kind of follow our own interests, might look a bit different to what those countries would want us to do. And so there's also criticism that there's been a kind of overemphasis on private sector involvement in the Just Energy Transition Plan. There's a lot of focus on, well, we'll kind of provide these government guarantees, and then the private sector will come in and build from there. But in climate finance, when mitigation finance is much better funded than adaptation, for example. So mitigation is about reducing emissions. So it's about energy, shifting transport systems, etc. But mitigation has more opportunities for profit because of renewable energy, whereas adaptation is about kind of shifting how your economy works to preserve water, to reduce kind of vulnerability to climate change. It's a much less clear, bankable kind of project-based process. And so the problem with some of this funding direction is that it's focusing on mitigation. It's driving the private sector investment in bankable projects. And what South Africa needs is, sure, mitigation, but also adaptation. It's as important for us because in Southern Africa, we are warming at twice the global rate. So where the global kind of official warming rate is about 1.2 degrees now, I think, that means Southern Africa is experiencing 2.4 degrees of warming. So yeah, there's this power imbalance where these international countries might be shifting or kind of controlling some of the focus of where this funding is going. And if we were to determine it all on our own, and if we had better kind of more influence in this negotiation, we might be able to determine those things ourselves, which would ultimately be better for our broader socioeconomic issues like inequality and unemployment. We can't just address climate change. We have to think about these things holistically.
And Catherine, just thinking of the intersections, right, where there is this real crisis of climate change, as Julia points out, but also there is this, the inequality between the global north and the global south that exist. So how do we make sure also, thinking about the jobs, that when we move away from the hard to abate carbon intensive industry, we do so in a just manner. Also thinking that, in 2026, the global north is implementing certain taxes that might have implications for jobs in the context of South Africa. How do we find the balance, of all these competing interests, but also just keeping in mind that we have a crisis in our hands?
A really difficult one, because I think, from the financial angle, on the one hand, we should absolutely be pushing for climate financing from the global north. That's something that's been agreed to in the Paris Agreement. There's a historical debt that needs to be paid, etc. And yet we're getting this finance on terms that doesn't really work for us, right? So there's on the one hand this kind of push for trying to get finance that is fairer, trying to get finance that's done kind of with less of these power imbalances that Julia's spoken about, financing that's much more kind of grants than it is loans. So there's kind of that push that I think we continuously need to be doing. But I also think that kind of domestically, we need to have a much clearer kind of self-defined kind of policy orientation that is also about our interests. So for example, I mean, I think green hydrogen is such a classic case. Kind of, we really need massive upscaling of renewable energy. We need massive investment into the grid. And yet kind of we're pumping investment into green hydrogen, which requires renewable energy, but that will go essentially offshore and be exported. And we do need exports. I mean, especially if we're going to lose some of our other big export sectors like automotives. But I think it really is about balancing our priorities and foregrounding them. And I think there's also then ways of doing that. For example, kind of in the just energy transition, there's a massive push for the privatization of the grid, the transmission grid. And so there's also ideological principles about kind of keeping things publicly owned, keeping things as opposed to kind of the privatization of both generation, transmission, and then distribution. So I think it's about asserting those kinds of principles in these processes. One of the big issues with the way that the just transition has unfolded is in this kind of project by project manner. So the donor countries, essentially, they put out a call, people can submit, or they kind of select projects. So in the register, there are 150 projects. But we kind of know, those of us kind of who've been working in the just transition space, that we need much more comprehensive, transformative change to achieve a just transition. We'll never achieve a just transition through kind of individual projects. And so I think kind of the donor-led process of a just transition that works through projects doesn't allow us to institute more kind of radical changes, such as comprehensive social protection, which will be absolutely necessary to address kind of job losses, the uncertainty associated with the future labor force. So not just kind of individual job losses in the coal sector, but the kind of knock-on effects more broadly. And I think that, can only come from our own civil society pushing for that, from kind of a broad-scale response. And so, it is a really tough one, kind of balancing all these different components. But I think we must, as kind of South African civil society and researchers and academics, kind of keep trying to assert the broader kind of national interests of communities and workers that are not just about kind of really specific and kind of small project, kind of the just transition in kind of project form. Because only that way, South African society wasn't just before. And if we're trying to make it just after, it has to be something more transformative than kind of a piecemeal process.
Perhaps just getting your board reaction or just concluding remarks on, and you began sort of, engage with the question of civil society and involvement of communities. There is a sense that, the mainstreaming of the term just transition has sort of taken away the justice part of it. So even in thinking like projects like green hydrogen, for instance, how do we reclaim, the justice part of, of the just energy transition? I'll start to do that, Julie.
Sure. I think that's the real question. And I think one of the issues is that we are using the term so freely that, just transition this, just energy transition, when actually there is maybe a transition happening, not really at the moment, because actually it's an expansion in our energy production because we don't have enough electricity at the moment, and reducing the carbon intensity of our electricity system actually means that we need to expand and increase the amount of electricity we're producing. So there's actually an expansion happening. And in order for it to be a transition, that will take a long time, and that will have to, include decommissioning of coal over time and in a very planned and managed way. And then for it to be just, at the moment, there is no just transition. There's the current kind of crises in places like Komati, where there has been a decommissioned power plant and people have lost jobs, and the town has been kind of sitting, even though there've been many promises about new initiatives and new job creation. There has been a kind of significant loss of livelihoods for communities in Komati. And so, there's not a just transition happening now. And exactly as you say, how do we reclaim this kind of focus on justice? And I think it requires significant mobilization across different groups. So, COSATU is doing quite a bit of work on ideas around just transition. What are alternatives to a just energy transition plan? They're holding a conference in the next few weeks where they're kind of bringing some global South parties together to think about those issues. There's also a need for, I think, kind of mobilization of civil society more broadly. So workers and civil society organizations working together to say, well, what does a just transition look like for us, and why wouldn't we want this current format to be to unfold, and what do we need in place of that? And so, I think there's a massive call for mobilization. I don't have the answer as to how we do that, but I think creating kind of these kind of podcasts where you're creating broad awareness and understanding of these quite difficult concepts that are, as we kind of said, thrown around. There's not much transparency on what's happening, is a really good start. So I think, better transparency, better understanding can support that mobilization, hopefully.
And Catherine, just briefly, how do we make sure that there's accountability, that the money that has been put for this just transition, that indeed it goes to communities?
I mean, I think kind of the South African civil society space, social movements are kind of, it's an incredible space to kind of be in. And I've already done so much work. So, the kind of criticisms of the prioritization, the criticisms of the lack of transparency, kind of the articles that we've seen. So I think there has been a real engagement by kind of broad parts of civil society for increased accountability. I think things like the grant register are a direct result of that. And so I think kind of the consistency about that is really important. And I also think that it's really important that kind of different parts of civil society kind of see climate change or kind of have solidarity around this issue, because so many different elements are kind of relevant, people pushing for the extension of grants and kind of a universal basic income. That's so important for kind of climate change, the increase in social protection, for better schools, for better hospitals. Like there's such a broad range for improved infrastructure and basic service delivery. All of these kind of matter in whether or not we'll be able to achieve climate justice, whether people will be able to live in kind of a warming world, live well in a warming world. We can do none of these things under the context of austerity. So kind of the anti-austerity movements are really important. So I think finding these alignments in different spaces is really key. So even if you're not a climate activist per se, finding solidarity from climate change spaces, showing solidarity also for other kind of progressive struggles in South Africa and then across the global South is kind of really important, because in our context, climate change isn't a standalone issue. It will always be intersecting with the many other injustices and inequalities people face in their everyday lives.
That was Julia Taylor and Katrina Lehmann-Grube from the Southern Center for Inequality Studies, based at Wits University. This podcast series, produced in partnership with Action Aid International, is available on our website, www.makua.org.za, and wherever you get your podcast. Do follow Makua Wamua on social media for more content on the work we do. I am your host, Musa Wenkosi Kabe. Take care.